Florida is in the midst of an enormously consequential election right now, and there is nothing more important on the ballot than Amendment 4, the constitutional amendment that would overturn Florida's just draconian abortion ban, one of the strictest abortion bans in the entire country. So today we're going to talk with a top Florida organizer and a board member of the Amendment 4 campaign. We're going to talk about some of the awful, heartbreaking impacts that Florida's abortion ban has already had on patients, but also how abortion bans fit within this broader effort led and funded largely by a very few right-wing billionaires to maintain control over everything and everyone from women to workers to wealth. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter and podcast in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses that wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. My guest today is Roxey Nelson. She's an executive vice president with 1199 SEIU United Healthcare Workers East, which is the largest union of healthcare workers in Florida. Roxey is also on the board of Floridians Protecting Freedom. That's the group sponsoring Amendment 4, which I'm sure viewers of this show know by now is the proposed constitutional amendment that would overturn Florida's near total abortion ban. I got to tell you, this is one of the more fascinating conversations I've had since starting this podcast. We talk about some of the real world impacts that Florida's abortion ban is already having and the importance of repealing it, but also about some of the broader themes of control that cut across the entire right-wing agenda, from busting unions to demonizing trans people to cutting taxes for billionaires and big corporations. Before we get to it, though, don't forget to click the like and subscribe buttons so you never miss an episode when they pop. And if you hear something in this conversation that sparks a thought, please make sure to leave a comment too. Okay, here's the convo with Roxey. Roxey Nelson, welcome to the show.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Jason, for having me.
I appreciate you joining me. Part of the reason I wanted to have you on the show is some of the work you're doing as part of SEIU with the Amendment 4 initiative. Could you sort of tell folks a little bit about what your sort of what you do and what your role is with Amendment 4 too?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have the honor of serving as the executive vice president for the largest healthcare workers local here in Florida, but also in the country. We organize hospitals, home care, nursing home workers, and we, in a practical way, help them bargain for wages and benefits, making sure that we're raising standards in the healthcare industry for workers, protecting jobs, making sure jobs are good jobs where workers have a voice on the job. And then we advocate for policy in the legislature that impacts members, but also our communities, because I think like 70% of nursing home funding moves our public dollars.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, from public to private, and about 40, people don't know this, but 40 to about 50% of hospital funding. Same. And so it's
Right.
really critical that our members are in tune with what's happening politically and where the decisions are getting made about the tax dollars we spend that impact their jobs. So that's the first thing. And because we're a healthcare workers union, the biggest healthcare issue on the ballot this year
Right.
is Amendment 4, and trying and doing our damnedest to beat back this abortion ban that the state legislature and Ron DeSantis have put in place. And so, yeah, that's how I orient 1199 and SEIU as a executive board member of the ballot initiative, or help provide guidance and strategic, guidance for the last year and a half on the
Yeah.
ballot, help raise money and do the thing. So yeah, that's about it.
That's great. Let me ask you, as sort of you take this question to everyone, as someone who works in the healthcare space, works with healthcare workers, as a woman. Tell me about what the impact has been. Florida essentially passed two abortion bans, although they've only recently gone into effect. Although I guess the 15-week ban did go into effect. It was just sued. So we had a 15-week ban initially that had like basically no exceptions, and then an even more strict 6-week ban that had that had exceptions in name only, but my understanding incredibly difficult to actually access. But tell me what the impact of Florida's abortion bans have actually had, whether that's on healthcare providers, on women, on however you want to take the question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, the ban went into effect in June, like after this past
The
legend, the
6 week one,
6 week
right?
ban went into place after this. That's the one that's really restrictive
Right.
and is basically a near total ban.
Right.
And I was at a discussion for Black maternal health a couple of weeks ago, and there was a woman listening to the panelists speak. It was a panelist of healthcare advocates and doulas and providers and myself. And a woman raised her hand at the end and she said, I'm really angry. She said, I miscarried 2 months ago. And I'm really angry because I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something was different. I'm a mother, already a mother of two or three, I can't remember. But they kept saying to me, you're 6 weeks, you're at 6 weeks. And
Oh, wow.
she said she felt she understood that something was wrong with the pregnancy, but they weren't doing anything.
Right.
And she basically tells the story of basically having to almost bleed out
Oh
before
my
they gave her
God.
the care she needed. And I think in a real way, like sometimes until something happens to you and yours, you don't, like it's not real.
Right.
But there are people, women who are experiencing right now the impacts and might not know that the law passed and might not know like what the particulars are, but know that their maternal health care is just different. Because
Right.
doctors are afraid,
Right.
right? Doctors are afraid because they're under threat of providing, if you give a pregnant woman the care that they need, of going to jail
Right.
for providing that care. And so that just the chilling effect that has on the healthcare delivery system, the danger, and we've heard stories of women in other states, but we have tons of storytellers who are coming forward and saying, that I miscarried or I was miscarrying and they wouldn't give me what the care that I needed until it was almost too late and put my life in jeopardy. And that's what's happening right now in Florida. That's why this issue is so critical today, but also critical for the future. I think the thing with Florida is Florida, about 84,000 women get their reproductive health care, abortion care in this state annually.
Hmm.
So this loss impacts 84,000 women. And then beyond that, the other states in the South that still have abortion access cannot meet that volume. So I think the
Right.
other state is like North Carolina, and
Right.
so they can't provide. So that service is just lost if we didn't take on this fight. And so the impetus to take on the fight was like we knew that it was now that women, those 84,000 women a year, needed us to take action now, and and in so doing, if we are victorious, which I believe in my soul that we will be, we are saving lives. And so
Yeah.
that's what's at stake.
Yeah, yeah, it's not too often you have a constitutional amendment where you can literally say it's saving lives, but this is one of those cases. I've spent far more time than I ever expected to on the newsletter chronicling the DeSantis administration's taxpayer funded campaign against Amendment 4 and also Amendment 3, the amendment that would legalize marijuana, partially because I have never seen anything like this in the past, and then also it keeps expanding, it keeps escalating. There's just more to find. I'm curious. You've been around a long time. You've been active in other campaigns. What do you make of this? Have you ever seen anything like this, or just tell me your perspective?
Yeah, like I can't, I mean, I have been organizing in Florida since 2006. And I remember when there were moderate Republicans. Like I remember it.
What a
You know what I
day!
mean?
Yeah,
Like
right,
I remember that's how we in 2001 we passed safe staffing standards in nursing homes, working with Democrats and Republicans, and there were
right.
moderate Republicans who helped bring that to bear. The world is just so different. And just the brazen way with which they do not care. And the thing that we are trying to publicize nationally is that like Project 2025 is Florida 2024.
Right.
And you need to look no further than here to get super clear about what their intent is for our democracy. And so, I sometimes like hear myself like, am I being hyperbolic? Like, is this hysterical? Like, am I
Right.
hysterical? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
it's
Yep.
just so. It's like when we found out that I kept saying, because the lawyers called to let the board know that like this was happening, and I'm like, are you sure? So I'm skeptic, so I'm like, no, just all the questions. Are you sure?
Right.
What is this? What is this? And it's like at every turn, it's like, no, they're just doing the illegal thing. No, they're just
Yeah.
breaking. Yeah, no, they're just cheating. Yeah,
Right.
no, like, and they have no shame about it.
Right.
So that's what's different, right? There's a lack of even like I think always, right, in my opinion, as a leftist, like
Mm.
I feel like the right has always given lip service, from my partisan point of view, lip service to the idea of democracy. I've always felt like the idea of freedom, but at least they tried. Do you know what I
Right.
mean? At least they
Right.
kept up the pretense. I think post Donald Trump, no,
Yeah. Right.
they feel emboldened to act and do whatever they need to do to preserve power. And for me, as a Black immigrant, queer identified woman, I that's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
terrifying what that means for me in a world where their way of governing and governance wins, right? Which
Right.
is why we're doing everything in our power to so they don't, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, this used to be the party that like paid lip service to rule of law sort of stuff. And now like I mean there's so many different details you can pull out, but one that just always rattles around in my mind. They're taking money from the opioid settlement. The money that we got from Purdue Pharma and all these corporations that exploited the opioid epidemic that is supposed to go to like reducing harm going forward and like rebuilding and repaying, like restoring communities that have been devastated by this stuff. And they're using that to campaign against constitutional amendments. That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy.
Right. I mean, and sometimes I marvel at it, like in not, I'm disgusted, but I'm also like, damn,
Right.
like the chutzpah, the guts to just know the end that you want and be viciously like about it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's like the ruthlessness of it. Sometimes I'm like, all right, I see y'all. Like,
Yeah.
they don't care. They will do whatever they can do to, and they have no shame about it to retain power and win the day, even if
Yeah.
winning the day is counter to every belief they've ever held.
Yeah.
Power. That's
Right.
the end goal. It's the power in service of what I think are mega rich billionaires, which I fully, the disconnect between the leadership class, like the grass tops and the rank and file of that movement, just blows my mind,
Right.
right?
Right.
But yeah, yeah, crazy.
Yeah, when you mentioned also like Project 2025, it's obviously
Yeah.
become a huge deal, nationally. I mean, it's the playbook for Trump to follow if he's elected. I remember doing a bit of work into that and being astounded at just how much influence the Heritage Foundation has had in Florida the last couple of years. These were I ended up coming into like public records about this. They weren't even for the most part records I had found myself. It was a different watchdog group, but I'd written something about a bill they were interested in. We ended up connecting and they shared their records. And essentially every extremist law of the last like 3 years, you can directly put the Heritage Foundation's fingerprints on, like, so to your point of Project 2025 is Florida 2024, that's absolutely true, right?
Yeah.
Have
Yeah.
you, do you come across them much in your work, like the Heritage Foundation or kind of it's like the front groups it works through?
As I've gotten later into my 40s, my memory sometimes goes national right to work, I think.
Yeah, that's right. That's part of that sort of world. Yeah.
That world of that's where like with the anti-union laws that were passed and the what they're doing to the United Teachers of Day, like putting up like
Yeah,
faux
right.
like the infrastructure on the right, this idea of like these farms of thought, of conservative thought that then get fed out to these different entities to like move and seem like independent,
Right.
realizing emergent, and it's not. right? It's strategic and it's organized and it's 50 years in the making, and
Right.
it's billions of dollars to make it happen. And I think sometimes our side feels like, what's wrong with us? Like, why? You know what I mean? Like, well, the accusation of like, why can't you figure this out, or why? Because there's like this organized machine,
Right.
unlimited resource that's focused on one thing.
Right.
And yeah, we don't come up against, like, sometimes in Tallahassee, right, when we're fighting against some bill that, local rule, and right, they'll send their spokesperson and we know that they're pulling the strings
Right.
behind the scenes, but there's no way to call it out or really tag them to it. But we know they're there, but we see their fingerprints and everything. And they,
Right.
as of late, right, they, with Project 2025, they sort of like wrote it down and made it public, right?
I know. I'm stealing this joke from someone, and it's really funny to me that quite possibly the biggest mistake that the right made in the presidential election was just telling people what they wanted to do. Right? Like,
Well,
and that became a scandal.
yeah, I mean, do you like what was that, the Devil's Advocate? It's like one of my favorite lines in a movie where Pacino goes, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world he didn't exist. I really
Right.
love that because it's like, I feel like that's how so many people get away with so much. It's like, you
Right.
don't believe, and this time they're normally so good at it.
Right.
They blew it.
Right.
Right. It was like, they did that.
Right.
They just got so cocky that they
Right.
thought, oh, this is fine. Like, we've moved the needle far enough, and everybody's
Right.
like, sorry.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
What
The
is
devil decided he wanted to see a few headlines about himself, and like turns out people
Right,
didn't like that.
right, right,
Uh,
right.
I want to go back to another point you made. Actually, let me two things you brought up. One is I remember looking into the union busting bill in 2023, right? The one that was aimed at particularly at public sector workers, except
Yeah,
for the handful of public sector workers that have sort of pledged fealty to Ron DeSantis.
yeah.
But like that was my first experience in kind of like trying to crack inside a lot of these sort of right wing think tanks, because I remember there was this like quintessential moment where at one hearing there was like five different groups all in a row that came up to testify in favor, and like they all had different names, like anything I come up with, they're all going to be like, Progress for American Workers, and the Capitalism Institute, that sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
it gave this like real appearance, like there was this really
Diverse
grassroots.
coalition.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly,
Yep.
exactly. And then you go start like poking through the tax records of it, and they're all funded by the same handful of billionaires. It's like Dick Uihlein and the Koch brothers and and like the DeVosses, and that's it, right? It's wild.
It's wild. And also, like, that's what they accuse us of.
Right,
So like
right. Yeah, George
right, it's like,
Soros.
yes, George Soros, but also like our own institutions, like labor, like not that labor represents, everyday people who work,
Right.
but that we're this big bad, and they just do such a just sharp job at making us the enemy while they are doing exactly what they're accusing us of, but
Right.
somehow getting away with it. And even as much as the left is like, but look, it's sort of like it gets lost, and it's like,
Right.
how do they do that?
Which comes back to the thanks guys for writing it all down for I mean,
Exactly.
the thing that made Project
Exactly.
2025 stick is people were like, go look it up. It's like
Right.
they got a website about it. They're really proud of
Right.
it.
Right.
And the other piece I wanted to get you to elaborate on is so going back to this Heritage Foundation Project 2025, its tentacles into so many different things in Florida.
Yeah.
For instance, one of to give you an example, it turns out they were deeply involved both in that union busting bill, but also the 6-week abortion ban in Florida, right? And so part of me is thinking like what on earth does making it harder for workers to collectively bargain have to do with denying a woman the ability to get an abortion, right? Or to make her own sort of choices about her own body. And it comes back to, you touched on it, control. And I want you to just kind of like elaborate on that dynamic and how that crosses across that cuts across so much of what we're seeing in
You
Florida.
know, I have so many theories on this. I think about the 1980s, that the right is is really anchored in power for the few, resources for the few, because profit at the end of the day for the few is their like that's their goal and the things that support that world. So it's like, they're like the nuclear family, right? And free market, small government. That's their world.
Right.
And anything that they need systems that like hold up that belief system and make it work for as long as they can. And I think to me, everything comes back to that. And whereas on the left, it's like we're trying to get as much and as many, right? Like for the many,
Right.
maximum resources for the many. And
Right.
it's just like a different worldview. And so I think there's something anchored in that. I also think about this like, this new, was it Margaret Thatcher who talked about like, it's just the nuclear family now and that's everything. That's
Right.
not the way the world was before. We thought about the village. We thought about
Right. Right.
grandparents and multi-generational living. And I think that the ability, like this whole trad wife movement that's like happening in
Right.
the world and like speaking to masculinity in a specific kind of way that like reinforces that power dynamic,
Right.
that sort of like, you know, white supremacy sort of masculine, like not, and that is not against men or white people, right?
Right.
It's a way of understanding the world that reinforces and holds up the ability for a few people to run away with all the spoils. And so
Right.
I think it's that dynamic that I would call out. I think I talk to people about sort of the role, I believe why working in labor is so important to me, because I think this, like we're not anti-capital, but it's like markets for good, right?
Right.
Like we can raise resources to be able or have an economy that functions not just for the profit of the few, but for the good of many. Like, how does the world become that? And so I think about, like the ways in which the things that we do to advance that world on the left and that worldview, they're trying to do something different. And so like, it's I think everything they're doing, that power you're talking to, that control is really about that. I don't think it's genuine. I
Right.
think there's some parts of their coalition that's like super religious. I think that sort of like white nationalist plus a religious bend, right? Like is
Hmm.
in there. I also think that, the left has left parts of our population unspoken to, right? Like I think, as a critique for labor unions, like that's our base. And
Right.
so if we stop talking to our base and somebody else starts talking to them and they're like, yeah, life is harder. I can't make ends meet. My dollar isn't going as far as it used to. I can't own a home. I can't send my kids to college, and they're looking for an answer. So yeah, it's the immigrant, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
the only people giving me the answer is that answer. And so I'm not going to believe that, I'm the problem. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
Right.
I think it's a lot, Jason, like to tease back. And I think all of that is inside of there. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. It's sort of one way I think I've thought about it, particularly across a lot of the economic stuff. And I think this is kind of what you were saying at one point, but maybe flipped from a different perspective. But the same thing
Yeah.
is that like and the story I'll tell you here, this is when I was, you remember there was this push this year to like roll back Florida's child labor laws,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
for
Yeah.
the children yearn for the mines, let's go back to that world, right? And
Yeah.
so that was one of these Project 2025 groups, the Foundation for Government Accountability, that was pushing that. And so I had separately come across a bunch of records showing different ways that they had been involved in policy. And when you started to pull back at it, like a lot of the things that they were most involved with, like, working to deny any sort of Medicaid expansion, working to make unemployment benefits as hard as possible to obtain, all basically social safety net benefits. The same was true of food stamps. The same was true of TANF, temporary cash assistance. They were also looking to essentially put more students into the workforce. Like even this alone is not a policy that I actually had a problem with, but it fit into a larger theme. That they were pushing to allow like work, just part-time jobs, to count as like service requirements for like scholarships and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Vocational, yeah,
Right, right.
internships and
Yeah, and then union busting was a big part of what they're doing. And the way it all kind of fit together for me is that everything that they were doing was designed to essentially dilute the power of workers, right? Like either flood the labor market, deny access to economic security, safety nets, all sorts of ways to keep, like, for sort of lack of a better way to say it, to keep people like hungry and desperate and sort of willing to work for whatever job came they could find at whatever pay, at whatever, however few benefits, And so I think so much of the model seems to be built around on the right, particularly the economic right, seems to be built around, in addition to like as much as possible for the few, as little as possible for the many. And I know it's like kind of the same math equation, but that's part of how they make sure that all these people like support the system that they've built for themselves. Does that sort of, I'm curious how you pinball
Yeah,
off of that.
yeah. I think what that triggered for me is I've been studying biomimicry,
Oh,
which is
wow.
yeah, which is the study of how we can, as we build human systems and as we exist in this world, how humans can learn from the wisdom of the natural world. Lot used a lot in sort of like architecture and design, but trying to figure out how to apply it, not me, but others who are much smarter than me, to social innovation. And I think the thing that you just said about like why they do that, I still think it comes back to capital and the power and the control.
Hmm.
And the thing in nature, I learned about sort of like feedback loops, that there are reinforcing feedback loops in nature and balancing feedback loops. I'm gonna like butcher it, but from my like cursory understanding, it's like in nature, if organisms or any type of entity gets into a reinforcing feedback loop and there aren't balancing feedback loops, like that's what entities want. They want to keep producing themselves and they don't want
Right.
anything to stop them. But in nature balances it so that you don't die. Because if you keep reinforcing a thing, you kill yourself. It can't be sustained. And I think when I look at the way capital operates in our world, I think that's what it is, right? It's capital's drive to keep reinforcing itself.
Yeah, right.
Profit over profit, right? And we are like, people, but that's what it's doing. It's doing what it's built to do.
Right.
The other thing it's doing is that it's trying to diminish the balancing feedback loops. And
Hmm.
labor unions are a balancing feedback loop.
Right, right.
Organized workers are a balancing feedback loop. And I say to the party sometimes it's like, the right doesn't necessarily hate workers per se. They hate workers having the power to be able to create that balance. And we do that through sort of the governing of the opposition. And
Right.
so that dynamic is what they're trying to impact. It's like if workers were on there, they wouldn't care. They would do things to make sure they're really good about making sure their base has what they need when their base calls them to, right?
Right.
But when they can demonize, they do that. So I agree with you. Like I think there's something about how capital reinforces itself to sustain power, to sustain control, to keep growing, to get more. And it's wanting to get rid of all the things that stops it. And I think labor unions are right in the path of that. And I think
Yeah.
that's why it's fundamental, right? Like, and not even just from a place of like workers being able to advocate for more for themselves or for community or the rising tide lifts all, but not even just from there, but from the idea of like investing in the opposition, right?
Right.
That wants to govern different to the other worldview.
Right.
That's actually the dynamic that it's trying to like break up. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, it does make sense. I think, and I think it's McKenna Schuler, who's a tremendous reporter at the Orlando Weekly here. Like
Mhm.
the alt media scene, alt weekly scene in Florida is still so good. She has done a lot of reporting on labor policy and come across a lot of records where I think it's like very explicit in that so much of what's motivating a lot of the union busting stuff on the right is just trying to get at any sort of power structure or source of funding for any in this case it's Democrats, but basically any sort of ideological opposition that is interested in a different kind of system, right? Like so much of this is motivated by that.
And when you look at the records, like I mean, it's wise because I remember once I was watching Selma. It was a movie. It was Selma with my friend Caitlin, and we were watching the movie and we were watching the marches. We're both labor organizers, and we recognized like the Marshall jersey was a union.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah. And we
Yeah.
were like, they don't even mention unions.
Mhm.
We're like, do you know what I mean? We're like the glue in between that like no one speaks about, but it's all over movement.
Right.
And but they know that, right? And so it's a strategic move, right? To undermine the pinnings of an opposition that's advocating for a different worldview. It's totally right. It's totally right.
Right, right. And let me sort of loop this back to Amendment 4, but
Yeah.
like passing something like that, something proactive that among other things, I think would be like an incredibly strong rebuke to just the excesses of Tallahassee the last couple of years, specifically as it's been bent to the will of one man's presidential ambition, one man's ambition to try and get as far to the right as possible in a Republican primary. How important is something like that, passing Amendment 4 in terms of rebalancing the scales or sending even beyond the sort of positive? We talked about some of the extreme like impacts of right now that people are feeling under an abortion ban, but even just beyond sort of undoing those harms in terms of sending a message that like things have gone too far. Just I wonder how does Amendment 4 fit in kind of this broader conversation we're having?
Yeah. I mean, I think post 2020, like presidential election result, I think Florida is in a really tough spot politically. The national funding establishment sort of they have fatigue with us, right? They speak to our side. Well, they talk about us being a red state. And the argument that we've been making is that we are not a red state, that
Hmm.
we are fundamentally a gerrymandered, right? Like under-organized state where like what I say to people is the right sees this state, Florida, as its main dish. And the left always positions Florida as a side dish. And
Right.
in that reality of the world, it's with sustained investment. Because like you said, those infrastructures that they've built on the right, the Heritage Foundation, and it's not just 3 months before an election.
Right.
It's like when Maria happens and they are helping new Puerto Ricans into the state get acclimated, but also doing the civic engagement work, having the infrastructure to do that. The fact that they're doing that and they're building that infrastructure year round, I think that is a core piece, and I think I just lost my train of thought, but a core piece of how how they are sustaining the power that they do have. Asked me the question that you were just asking me again. I lost my
Well,
train of thought.
yeah, I guess I was asking like passing Amendment 4. Obviously,
Yeah.
it's urgent in its own just like
Yeah.
policy merits, but in that larger sort of broader struggle and the larger sort of forces and dynamics we've been talking about, how does it sort of fit within that?
Yeah. So the argument I was making is that Amendment 4 is critical, right?
Hmm.
Our ability to say, no, you're wrong, right? Like, actually, we can prove it again because we've done it in the past with the other Amendment 4, with minimum wage. We
Right.
do when we have what would the good, the right issues, we win them statewide. When we fight locally, like we did in the mayoral race in Jacksonville and the special election in Orlando, Osceola, like we have a good candidate, concentrated, consistent organizing on the ground and issues that matter to the constituencies. We know how to win, and we do win. And so I think this amendment helps us reinforce that point. And I think
Hmm.
it's really critical for us here in Florida because we live here and we love the state and we want to make sure it's right sized for the future. But it's also for those of us on the left who recognize and look at the national map and recognize that, like, the growth in this state and a couple of other southern states is the path to the future of nationally,
Right.
like, governing in this country. And so for the left to like take the state off the map, it's it's idiotic.
Right.
It's unstrategic. It's right. Like,
Right.
so I think, and we knew the moral and had the moral conviction around this issue for sure. And there was fire and excitement in the field. It's a group of women in Palm Beach County who were just like, we're going, you know what I mean? And everybody was
Right.
like, okay, you know what I mean? But beyond that, that this is an opportunity again to say, no, we are on the map. We need to be on the map. We need to stay on the map because you do not win this country nationally 10 years from now without us on the
Right.
map. Do you know what I mean? So I
Right.
think for
Right.
those reasons, absolutely. Even the reasons you say of like, like, can we shake the sort of concern, like sometimes on issues like Medicaid expansion,
Right.
there's no real opposition to it, right? It's
Right.
ideological from the heritage, right? Like, and people
Right.
are afraid to buck, Republicans are afraid to buck leadership, even rural Republicans who know they need the money. And
Right.
so doing, strategies that say like, actually, no, you are further away from the middle and where the state is than you need to be, and you guys are out of the mainstream, helps moderate and like moderate Republicans, they don't really exist, but like the moderating forces of that caucus, I think also would be a
Right.
benefit of this. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. And moderate Republicans, I guess they do exist. They just don't win elections anymore because of gerrymandering, right? They're all in primaries. They get run out. Let me actually ask you before I let you go about Medicaid expansion too, because I'm curious your take on this, dynamic. Because you're right. It is a fascinating issue in that the big business lobby wants Medicaid expansion. The hospitals were behind a big push a couple of years ago in Florida. There are rank and file Republicans, plenty of places that want it, particularly tonight. There's even a Republican in the Florida legislature, a doctor, has come out publicly for it, right? And that's one Republican, but it's really hard to do when you're actually in elected office and you've got to think about future Republican primaries and you're dealing with colleagues who are all sort of, on the same team, right? Like team dynamics triumph over thing. And yet, despite all this, it doesn't move anyway. It doesn't move at all. And near as I can tell, it's solely this really does become now a billionaire issue. There's a handful of billionaires whose long-term concern is making sure that there's never higher marginal income tax rates, so there's never estate taxes, and so they're against any kind of entitlement sort of situation. And so that's why Medicaid expansion does best. Dick Uihlein doesn't want his heirs years from now to have to pay taxes. But I mean, the issue more. Like, why is it so intractable, and how do you sort of long term crack that nut? Do you think?
It's it's exactly what you've said. So behind the scenes, it's the billionaires who are serving their own economic interest,
Right.
right? And then it's this ability when you get an issue where you can demonize the people who are getting the help, right? It could be like, why are we paying for healthcare for able-bodied, adults? Like, because that's. And so I think it's those two things, linked together. I also think is the power dynamics in Tallahassee that we need to shake loose. Again, the argument around how to make moderate Republicans more afraid of their constituents
Right.
than they are of the billionaire. And, on our side, I can take some responsibility. Like, there hasn't been enough focus on sort of like this, like, moderate Republican strategy of like, they do it to us all the time. They run people against us, and we're not doing that as aggressively. And I think that's one of the pivots that we need to make because their constituents, they know their constituents need this and support this, right?
Right.
Like, you saw after Kentucky, the Affordable Care Act passed. In Kentucky, it was like, they're like, we hate Obamacare, but we love the Affordable Care Act. It's
Right.
like,
Right.
and so that dynamic exists here too. And I think, if we when we advance this issue, I'm not going to say if, when we advance this issue, I think we're gonna have to create a groundswell in places where we normally aren't to get them to feel like they have the cover to do what
Yeah.
they do is right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to tell one just little quick story because you mentioned like it's become so easy to demonize the other side and try and create like villains and create resentment that people don't deserve stuff. But like the face of Medicaid expansion to me has always been my vet. There are some old ladies that work at the front desk. They're like techs, old white ladies, by the way. Like you would not think any of them. They look like, their hair, they look like they're not struggling for anything. And I remember once I was checking out with my dog and I was just having a conversation with one of them, and somehow it came up that she doesn't have health insurance. This woman who's got a full-time job, she's working she's not a vet tech, she's a receptionist at the vet. And I was like, "Oh, wow, what's going on?" And she was one of the victims of Florida Medicaid refusal to expand Medicaid expansion. She makes too much money to qualify for traditional Medicaid and not enough to afford it on her own. And so she was just going bare. And like that's who this affects, right? It is not some like lazy cartoon cliche villain that like the right wants to create.
Yeah.
And yet that doesn't sort of get through to folks.
I think it got through because, like, I remember in 2013 we were campaigning. It's like every editorial board, every they just it's the fear, right? So it's
Right.
like I'm in leadership. I will never get my, the hospital association, right? Like they got it. Like Rick
Right.
Scott nailed it after, right, this because of their like full-throated support of it, and that backed them way off, right?
Right.
And they haven't found their voice again to articulate again why this is good for the state, why this is good for
Right.
people in cities and rural parts of the state, good for business, because they got punished, right? So
Right.
it's like not even just the idea of like we disagree, but that they will be spiteful like,
Right.
and
Right.
come for you. So I think there's that added part of it as well, for sure. For
Yeah, that
sure.
makes sense. Okay, let me try and leave this with a little bit more uplifting a thing. So, and again, circling it back to Amendment 4, I assume most of the people that listen to this are probably pro Amendment 4. Just feel like I could take that leap.
A
But
hunch.
for yeah, for folks that are listening and maybe don't already think about this, what are some things they can do beyond voting for it? Like we've got a couple of weeks to go. This will probably post in a couple of days here, but still, like early voting is about to begin. What are the best ways to try and get involved, whether that's Amendment 4 or just sort of broader issues that folks care about?
Oh, I appreciate that question so much. Floridians Protecting Freedom. That's the website that if you go to, it'll give you access to being able to give. That they are filing all these lawsuits and things against us. So we're raising for the campaign, but we're also raising for legal battles.
Right.
So like giving resources if you have it to help us take this on. One of the things we always talk about is like after watching the First Amendment for and the implementation challenges that existed, the awareness that we have to be ready for that part of we can't just be ready to win the war, but we have to also, my friend Alfonso says, we have to win the peace.
Right.
And so, like, being ready for that and getting resources to do that. But more urgent than that right now is if your ballot's at home, like I'm looking at ballot returns, it's like get your ballot in, stop messing around, like fill your ballot out, go ahead and vote early, and make sure that we've seen research that says that people will move more if people in their own networks move them. So again, after you vote, get your ballot in or go vote early, like text your, voting age friends and family in the state that are with us and make sure they go vote. Like that's the way you can multiply your vote is by also doing your own GOTV of your universe. That's critical. And then you can come and volunteer. The website will give you information to help us knock doors, make phone calls, send text messages. Right now, we're in a turnout game, right? If we want to win, we have to get 61%. They have to get 41%. And so we have a higher burden in the state. We would win this thing outright if democracy ruled the day.
Right.
But we have a path, but it's a narrow path, and we've got to do everything in our power to get every vote in that's on our side. So we need help. So Floridians Protecting Freedom, that's the website, and you can find ways to give, ways to volunteer, check your voter information, and just help us organize this thing in GOTV. I think that's what's most important right now.
That sounds great. Roxy Nelson, this was one of the more fascinating conversations I've had in a while. I appreciate you doing this.
Super cool. Thank you so much. I
All right.
love it.
All
Thanks for
right.
having me.
We'll talk to you soon. Okay. Thank you once again to Roxy Nelson for joining the show. That's a conversation that I suspect is going to be rattling around my brain for a little while yet. Before you go again, though, just a quick reminder to click those like and subscribe buttons and leave us a comment with any sort of thoughts or feedbacks you have, whether it's about this show, past shows, any subjects you'd like us to get involved to cover in a future episode. Any feedback is welcome and appreciated. Okay. With that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.